Hey guys, I've had some questions about our quizzes. I'm gonna post some. I'm not gonna post a video with instructions. I'm gonna post like a post with some instructions on that in the beginning of the week, or soon after I've posted this, I guess. But it's gonna be on everything we've covered up until right now, and I will post some more instructions about that later. I'm gonna try to get through federalism and the U.S. Constitution quickly. I've got some sleeping babies. I know Betsy has been kind of my guest star lately, but hopefully she can make it through asleep right now while I get through this. All right, so we're going to talk about federalism and the United States Constitution. So what if we forgot about our Constitution and suddenly we used the French Constitution, but we still had our same politicians and our same buildings in place? That wouldn't be American politics, though. It's not the people or the buildings, it's the rules and the ideas and the narratives that give them life and meaning. Rules just don't drop from the sky. They're written and ready to be implemented, created by human beings who want to establish procedures to help them, and those like them, us, to get what we want from the system. Politics is who gets what and how. If you change the rules, you change who's advantaged and disadvantaged by the rules. The founders wanted rules, but they really disagreed about what the basis of the rules for our government should be. They had to craft new rules to achieve their goals of a government whose authority came from the people, but whose power was limited to it so as to preserve the liberty of those people. Rules that fail to meet this test are inconsistent with the narrative of liberty and self-rule that they were promoting. But the rules that did limit self-rule had to be couched kind of in terms that made them seem to be strengthening freedom. So how should our laws be made? Should they be made by the people, by like a parliament? Should there be two houses? Should there be one house? Should there be an executive branch, a king? Think back to our first week when I asked you to craft your own government. Like, how would you create it? Our Constitution is kind of our official rule book about all of that. We have three branches of government here. The legislative, the executive, and the judicial. All three branches have the power to legislate, make laws, to administer those laws or execute them, and to adjudicate them, interpret laws. The legislative branch, that's where I've spent most of my career working, is for the legislative branch. I worked for Congress, for the House and for the Senate, the United States House and Senate. And this is the legislative power. This is the lawmaking body. This laws can be created by a ruler or by a party, can be defined from religion or made by citizens who have the power to obey these rules. But the legislature is the body of government that makes the laws. It can be set up differently. It can have one chamber or two. The members can be appointed. It can be elected. It can be hereditary, elected by people or some other body. In this country, we have what's called a bicameral legislature. This is a legislature with two chambers. In the United States, we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the House, folks are elected to serve a term for 2 years, and in the Senate, for 6. In Federalist Number 10, Madison argued that laws should be made by representatives of the people. He rejected pure democracies or systems where citizens can make and administer their own laws. We talked about that earlier. A pure democracy would be difficult. That would mean you would have to go to the ballot box every time anything needed to be decided. He instead recommended a republic, which is a government where decisions are made through representatives of the people. And that's what we have now. You go and elect your congressman, your senator, and they are representing your voice. But they are what make us a republic. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 really spells out the specific powers of Congress. It's funny, when we were writing new legislation, when I worked on Capitol Hill, when you write a piece of legislation, you have to cite the constitutional authority for it, and almost every time we cited Article 1, Section 8. It's the necessary and proper clause. So you can do what's necessary and proper to carry out the duties. It can be interpreted very broadly, which is why we listed it for everything, and there's few restrictions on it. The House of Representatives is intended to be representative of the people. It's the people's house, the voice of the common man. To be in the House, you have to be 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years. Terms are only 2 years long, so members are constantly running for office. They're ousted constantly according to public whim. This was intentional, though. The founders wanted this office to be easily accessible and easy to influence based on changes in public opinion. The Senate's a little different. A little more permanent. It's not, I mean, it's 6 years instead of 2, so it's not permanent, but you're a little bit there for a little bit longer. You have to be 30 years old, a citizen for 9 years, so they're hoping that you're going to be older and wiser and more stable. The terms in the Senate last for 6 years, so you're not as swayed by changing public sentiment as you would be in the House. In the House, you're basically campaigning constantly. In the Senate, you can have some time to get some things done before you have to start campaigning for office again. Originally, the Senate was not elected directly by the people, but by the state legislatures. So like our South Carolina State House elected our members of the Senate. That changed now, and now that we obviously directly elect our senators. So what are some possible alternatives? We have a bicameral legislature. Bi means two chambers, House and Senate. Unicameral legislature is another alternative. It's not what we have. Unicameral, one. Unicameral legislature is a legislature with one chamber, right? The advantages to a unicameral legislation, you would have a faster, more efficient lawmaking. You would only have to be responsible to changes in public opinion, and there'd be more sense of identity with the government. The whole country could share the same fundamental interests. But the founders rejected unicameralism because it's difficult to represent people that way. And quick legislative responsiveness of the unicameral legislature can be tough. It's better to have smaller, safer units to protect from abuse of power. George Washington explained bicameral legislation by saying, just as one pours one's coffee into a saucer to cool it off, we pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. We used to say that a lot in DC. The Senate is kind of the where you go to cool off a little bit. The House is quicker and faster, the same thing. Quicker to get things done. The fires burn fast, but in the Senate, it's kind of where things go to cool off, which is why the COVID legislation is stuck in the Senate right now. So we haven't had another stimulus pass. It's stuck in the Senate right now, because that's where things go to cool off. The executive branch. Okay, so that was the legislative branch. The executive branch obviously is where the president is. This is the branch of government responsible for putting laws into effect. That is, they execute the law. The president is not part of the legislature, but he can propose and encourage and veto legislation. The Articles of Confederation we talked about earlier did not provide for an executive. They worried that it would threaten their liberty. They were trying to escape the tyrannical King George, and they didn't want a president. But the chaos under the Articles made it clear that they needed a stronger government, and that an executive was necessary. But how should it be one person? Should it be two? Could they seek re-election? How many times? Are they elected by the people or by the legislature? A lot of questions they needed to ask. So the Constitution said that the president would be a single executive, so we just have one president. He could serve an unlimited number of 4-year terms. Obviously, that was amended in 1951. They can only serve 2 elected terms. And chosen neither by Congress or the people, but instead by the Electoral College, which is an intermediary body that elects the president and is very controversial. We're going to spend a lot more time on that later this semester. Citizens vote not for the candidates, but for a slate of electors who cast their vote for the president. Article 2 establishes the executive. You have to be 35 years old, a resident for 14 years. The vice president serves if the president doesn't. If the president can't, then Congress determines future succession after that. So what are some possible alternatives for an executive branch? You could have a presidential system where the executive is chosen independently of the legislature and the 2 branches are separate. You could have an executive be independent, can be impeached for criminal activity just like ours. You could have a parliamentary system where a government is chosen by the legislature from among its members where the branches are merged, and the executive is accountable to the legislature. So like the prime minister in England is accountable to Parliament. And then you have the third branch of government is the judicial branch. The judicial branch has the power to interpret laws and to judge whether a law has been broken. In Federalist number 78, Hamilton said that the judiciary was the least threatening branch of power, which I don't agree with. I think it might be the most threatening branch. He said that the executive and the legislative branch can endanger liberty, but not the judicial branch. So they all need to be separate. He said the executive holds the sword. They can declare war. The legislature commands the purse. They have to pass spending bills. The government's about to run out of funding on September 30th, and so they'll have to pass a bill to keep the government open again. And the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. But it's still pretty powerful. Yeah, they don't hold the sword or command the purse, but having judgment is pretty powerful. They didn't want the judicial system to be too powerful or too political. These Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, provided good behavior, and are preserved from politics. Judicial review came about. This is the power of the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws. In Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall ruled that the Supreme Court is the ultimate interpreter of when making a law is unconstitutional. This is not an automatic part of lawmaking, only if a law is challenged and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, but it makes the Supreme Court very powerful. The Constitution it talks about the judicial branch in Article 3. It's very short, and it's been kind of left to be defined by Congress and by the courts itself. So what are some possible alternatives to a judicial branch? Legislative supremacy. An alternative to judicial review, the acceptance of legislative acts as the final law of the land. What if we gave judicial review more teeth? German citizens can ask their high court to determine if something is constitutional. Here it has to be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. But here in this country, we have something called the separation of powers and checks and balances, and those are very important. The separation of powers, this is the institutional arrangement that assigns judicial, executive, and legislative powers to different people or groups and limits the powers of each. Excuse me. A French philosopher explained this notion, arguing that putting all political power into one set of hands is like putting all of our eggs in one basket. So if one goes bad, they're all going to go bad. But if power is divided, if we put it all in different things, one can go bad, the other two will be okay, right? So they're all separated into different branches. Checks and balances. This is the principle that allows each branch of government to sort of exercise some control over the other branches. It ensures that no branch can exercise power tyrannically. The president can veto Congress. Congress can override a veto. The Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional. Congress can amend the Constitution. So they all can check and balance each other, which is very important and why our country has been so successful at governing. In Federalist 51, Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But we're not angels, and we're not governed by angels, right? Human nature is flawed. Humans can be greedy, corrupt, ambitious, and precautions need to be taken. So the separation of powers is important, and that was very easy for the founders, but checks and balances were a little more difficult. All right. Let's move on to federalism. It's clear in the Constitution that, we need to balance the power between national and state governments. But it's clear in the Constitution that national government trumps state government. Though the narrative of shared power has always allowed both sides to come together around this concept, effects of federalism that we see today, that the national government trumps state governments, we pay income taxes to the national government, and then they parcel out monies to the states. So even if you have like a state law, the national government can sometimes enforce its will, like a drinking law. The states can decide on a minimum drinking age, but the federal government can still impose their will. They say, we will withhold 5% of your highway funds until you mandate a drinking age of age 21. They say that it's a state law, but we're not going to give you money to pave your roads until you make this what we want it to be. So the federal government can still exercise power there. In the enumerated powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, like I talked about earlier, congressional powers are specifically named in the Constitution. All right, and then we remember the necessary and proper clause. This is the constitutional authorization for Congress to make laws required to carry out powers. This is also called the elastic clause because it can be interpreted so broadly. And the supremacy clause is the constitutional declaration that Constitution and laws made under its provision are the supreme law of the land. The Constitution is the supreme law. But the 10th Amendment says all powers that are not given to the national government are reserved for the states. But the necessary and proper clause makes it hard to see what's withheld from the national government. Y'all, I've taken an entire class on this in law school. I'll say that a lot of times this semester. We're going over this awfully fast, and it's a big concept to understand, but just kind of generally know that in federalism, the national laws, or state laws are trumped by national laws. Concurrent powers, though, are powers that are shared by federal and state governments. But the federal government's complex, and the Supreme Court tells us the limits of this power, and it changes over time. So two views of federalism: dual federalism, which is the federal system under which the state and national governments are responsible for separate policy areas. And then cooperative federalism. This is a federal system under which the national and state governments share responsibilities for domestic policy areas. That's kind of like swirled together cooperatively instead of having distinct layers, like dual federalism. But what are some alternatives to federalism? You could have a unitary system, a government where all power is centralized. Great Britain is this way. The local units, states or countries or whatever, may have some power at times, but basically they're all dependent on the central unit that can alter or abolish them. What if the national government could suspend the state legislature in Alabama during segregation to run the state from D.C.? That's impossible in the United States, but not in Britain, you know? We could also have what's called a confederal system, what you think about Articles of the Confederation. These are folks who wanted all the power to be in the states. So a confederal system is government in which local units hold all the power. An example here is like the United Nations, the European Union. The central government is dependent on them for their existence. The local government is sovereign. So what difference does federalism make? Federalism gives the founders a government that could take effective action, restore economic stability, regulate disputes among the states, but also allow some autonomy in the states and narrative that perhaps have more power than they do. It gives power to preserve local standards and solve problems at levels in which they occur, like traffic laws or housing codes or school policies. You know, if you need some local folks to weigh in on that kind of stuff. But there are disadvantages. When all policies are made and enforced locally, some economies of scale may be lost. There are different punishments for different crimes that can make it difficult to gauge the consequences of behavior across different states. For example, marijuana laws are different across every state, and so it's hard to know, you know, what if you're going to go to one state where it's legal and then you go to another state where it's not legal. Like that just makes it difficult to gauge the consequences of behavior. Let's see. So changing federalism over time. As historic events occur, the demands on different levels of government change, including the federal versus state government. We want to protect our rights, but it's now more than the first 10 amendments. We want economic security in our old age, right? We want a minimum standard of living, of safe highways, crime-free neighborhoods. Liberals tend to believe in a strong central government to solve their social problems like discrimination and poverty. Conservatives tend to think that big government creates more problems than it solves, like anti-federalists. They want more local and state government. So I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. In 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, it was a question of whether Congress could charter a bank, and the Supreme Court ruled confirming the supremacy of national law over state government here. So McCulloch versus Maryland kind of confirmed the supremacy of national over state government. Another Supreme Court case in 1824 was Gibbons versus Ogden. It established national authority over state business. Again, you could take an entire class in law school on this. In the Civil War, though, one of the largest issues of the Civil War was to resolve the question of national versus state supremacy. Nullification is declaration by a state that federal law is void within its borders. So Southern states tried to maintain their own narrative by invoking nullification, and then they seceded from the United States to reject national authority. But the Union victory showed that states did not retain sovereignty under the Constitution. The New Deal. We're skipping ahead in time here. When FDR was president, the Supreme Court maintained that there could be an anti-regulation stance, but the president really berated the Supreme Court during the New Deal. He was really trying to impose a lot of federalism to get the country back to work after the Great Depression. Eventually, the Supreme Court had a change of heart and established the New Deal policies as constitutional, and that really redefined the purpose of American government and the scope of state and national powers. Social Security was born during the New Deal and a lot of other national programs that were designed to get America back to work and back on its feet. The Americans started really looking to their president and their government to save them more than they had in the past. Federalism today is a renegotiated compromise that is a compromise between advocates of strong national government on one hand and advocates of state power on the other. If a party dominates in federal government for a long time, then its members look somewhere else to get to accomplish their aims, maybe look into state government. Devolution is the transfer of powers and responsibilities from the federal government to the state governments. we had kind of a devolution movement that came to stop in 2001 after September 11th. The Supreme Court now has a conservative majority that's really unlikely to change, and a lot of questions of contemporary federalism involve the national government trying to influence how states and localities go about providing goods and services and regulating behaviors that's traditionally been within their jurisdictions. Okay, so how does the national government try to influence the states? The character of rules. Are the rules going to be broad enough to allow states flexibility, or narrow enough to guarantee that the policy is executed the way that federal government wants? What about the cost of the rules? Is it going to be paid for by the national government? If so, how much will the government cover? And this is a lot of what I spend my time on in my work as a lobbyist. There are four congressional strategies for influencing the states. The first can be no national government influence. If they are imposing a new rule, they can say there's going to be no government influence here. There's no instructions provided. States can act as they wish. The second is something called a categorical grant. These are federal funds provided for a specific purpose. They're restricted by detailed instructions, regulations, and compliance standards. If a state complies with these requirements, then they can get the federal money. If the state does not comply, they do not get the money. It comes with a lot of paperwork for something like that. The third category is a block grant. These are federal funds that are provided for a broad purpose, and they're unrestricted by detailed requirements. Something like the Welfare Reform Act. It changed a categorical grant program to a welfare block grant to the states, gave states more leeway in defining rules of their welfare programs. Congress doesn't really like block grants because they don't like the states being able to kind of pursue their own agendas instead of what Congress intends them to do. And then the fourth is called an unfunded mandate. This is a federal order that mandates that states have to operate and pay for a program, even though it was created at a national level. The states have to do it, they have to pay for it, but the federal government says so, but they're not going to provide any money for it. Congress can force a state to comply by threatening criminal or civil penalties, or promising to cut funding off. Federal funds if a state doesn't follow its direction. For example, the Real ID Act, it was passed in 2005 after 9/11. The 9/11 Commission recommended it, and it's required for doing business with a federal agency. You have to have a real ID. We're still implementing this in South Carolina. It's very expensive, and all of the cost is shouldered by the states, but the federal government is requiring these real IDs to do business. So this is just something to think about. That's an unfunded mandate. Continuing tensions between national and state government. The current status of federalism is a mix of both narratives about returning powers to the state and national incentives. Members of Congress are elected locally, though, and so they have primary loyalties to their constituencies, not to a national audience. You know, Joe Wilson represents us here. He is going to think about what we care about in Lexington, not what somebody in California thinks about, right? His loyalty is to his constituency, not to somebody else. National inaction. I had a boss who all the time would say, when are we going to do something? And it's really left a policy vacuum being filled with a lot of state policy initiatives, because Congress is very polarized right now and a lot is not getting done. So this inaction is creating an opportunity for states to fill things with state policy initiatives. So how do you want to amend the Constitution, right? The Constitution is our rule book. It needs to have this ability to be changed over time. That's amendability, the provision for the Constitution to be changed so as to adapt to new circumstances. There have been over 10,000 amendments introduced, but the Constitution's only been formally amended 27 times. Their recent calls for amendments are things like banning abortion, banning gay marriage, banning flag burning, permitting prayers in schools. They're usually very partisan camp divides. Democrats tend to believe that change is inevitable and the Constitution is a living, flexible document that can have small alterations. Republicans tend to be suspicious of change and believe that founders' work needs not to be tampered with by unelected judges. But they'll change in fundamental ways, preferably by an amendment. So the Constitution says, Article 5, spells out a very confusing process for amending the Constitution. Can be proposed by 2/3 vote of the House and Senate, or when 2/3 of the state requests a constitutional convention, and then approved by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states, or conventions of 3/4 of the states. It's a very confusing process, which is why it's only been done 27 times. Some states make it hard to amend their own constitution. 12 states actually require that amendments pass in more than one session of the legislature. So like if they were to pass it in this year, they would have to pass it again next year in order for it to amend a state constitution. And then some states make it easier. Some they think that this gives a citizen a substantial role in the process. For example, the California Constitution has been amended more than 500 times instead of being subject to ordinary legislation. Is that trivialized? Does it kind of clutter up the Constitution? I tend to think it does. But public opinion can be really fickle, and we maybe don't always want the Constitution to respond quickly to public whim. The United States Constitution's weathered the test of time for two reasons. It's not too detailed and explicit, and it really guards against the extreme faculty that could render it too mutable, and the extreme difficulty that can perpetrate its discovered faults. Benjamin Franklin once said that he'd created a republic if you can keep it, but the Constitution only allows citizens the slimmest roles in keeping the republic. How do we do it? We really limit citizen participation. The founders kind of wanted it this way. They didn't really they didn't trust human beings. We'll talk about that a lot. The founders didn't trust other people. They didn't think they could handle power without being corrupted. They wanted power to serve as popular power to serve as a potential check on the elected leaders, and they wanted to impose strict checks on popular power as well. The Constitution was the republic's insurance against chaos and instability. But you can have direct democracy at the state level in three different ways. In an initiative, which are citizen petitions to place a proposal or constitutional amendment on the ballot to be adopted or rejected by a majority vote by bypassing the legislature. The second is referendum, an election in which bills pass the state legislature submitted to the voters for approval, and then recall elections, where a voter can remove an elected official from office. These are very infrequent. All right, that's all. That ended up being longer than I thought. I'm sorry, guys. This is a very important topic, though. I want you to think about why the founders chose to structure us with three branches of government. Do you think our Constitution has been flexible, or should it be more flexible or less flexible than it currently is? Do you think it fosters or limits our participation in the government? I'm not going to ask you to email me those this time because we're going to have a quiz this week, but I really want you to think about that. Do you think the Constitution has let us change with the times? Do you think it should be more flexible or less flexible? Why do you think we have three branches of government? And do we foster citizen participation or limit it? All right, guys, look forward to me posting something about our quiz, which will be later this week, and I will see you soon. Oh, by the way, this is going to be the only recorded lecture that you're going to get this week. We're just doing one lecture this week and a quiz, and then I'll be back next week with what's next on your agenda or your syllabus. Take care.